A black couple is forced out of a high-end luxury store by a security guard, but just 10 minutes later, he faces a fate no one saw coming. What led to his shocking downfall? Stay with us as we unravel the unexpected twist that will make you question everything. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from today. The luxury boutique was alive with quiet elegance, the kind of place where wealth whispered rather than shouted. Shoppers moved between displays of designer handbags and glass cases of diamond-studded watches. Their conversations hushed, their gestures refined. The air was scented with a delicate blend of expensive perfume and polished wood, a silent reminder that this was not just a store. It was an experience meant for the privileged few. Among the sea of high fashion and tailored suits, Alicia and Marcus Carter moved with effortless confidence. Alicia, striking in a fitted blazer and heels, traced her fingers over the soft leather of a handbag, its price tag discreetly tucked inside. Marcus, taller than most in the room, adjusted his cufflinks with an easy charm, his presence commanding yet unassuming. They exchanged quiet laughter, their connection clear, their presence seamless among the elite clientele. But not everyone saw it that way. Neil Harris, the store's newest security guard, stood near the entrance, arms crossed over his chest. He prided himself on being observant, on spotting trouble before it happened. And right now, trouble had a name. 2 names. Something about them unsettled him. They were too at ease, too comfortable in a place like this. His jaw tightened. He'd worked security long enough to know that appearances could be deceiving, and in his mind this was a red flag. Alicia reached for the price tag inside the handbag. Neil moved. "Excuse me," he said, voice firm, loud enough to draw attention. Marcus looked up, startled. Alicia, however, remained poised, arching a single brow as she turned to face him. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. Neil didn't smile. He didn't soften. "This area is for customers only." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Alicia's lips pressed together, but her composure didn't falter. "We are customers." Neil folded his arms, his stance unwavering. "If you're not planning on making a purchase, I'll have to ask you to leave." For the first time, Marcus's easygoing smile faded. His fingers brushed Alicia's wrist, a silent exchange, a signal to stay calm. But there was steel in his voice when he replied, "We're not causing any problems. We're shopping, just like everyone else." Neil's eyes flicked to the other customers, watching now, their gazes darting between the unfolding confrontation and the glistening merchandise. Some looked amused, others exchanged quiet whispers. Neil exhaled sharply, taking a step closer. "I'm not going to ask again." Tension thickened the air, pressing against Alicia's ribs. She wanted to push back, to demand an explanation, but she could already see how this would end. Marcus must have seen it too, because his hand tightened ever so slightly around hers. Without another word, they turned and walked toward the exit, their heads held high, their backs straight. Neil stood tall, watching them go, satisfaction curling at the edges of his lips. He adjusted his badge, then glanced at his coworker, Lisa, who had been watching from behind the counter. "You've got to keep control," he muttered, just loud enough for those around him to hear. "Standards have to be maintained." Lisa didn't respond. She just stared at him, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. Outside, Alicia and Marcus sat in their car, the engine idling in silence. Marcus drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, his usual warmth clouded by something sharper, something Alicia recognized all too well. Frustration, resignation, anger. Alicia sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her lap, her expression unreadable. But inside, she was anything but calm. Finally, Marcus sighed. "You think we should just let this go?" Alicia turned to face him, her gaze sharp, unwavering. "Let it go?" Her voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. "Marcus, that man humiliated us, in front of everyone." "I know." His voice softened, but there was hesitation there, an exhaustion she hated hearing. "But people like him? They don't listen. What good will it do?" Alicia didn't respond. Not right away. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began typing. "Who are you texting?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Caroline." The name alone shifted the energy in the car. Caroline Hastings wasn't just a friend, she was the regional director of the entire boutique chain. If anyone could do something about what just happened, it was her. "You're really doing this?" Marcus asked, a small shake of his head, his frustration slowly giving way to admiration. Alicia didn't look up. That guard has no idea who he just messed with. Her phone buzzed almost immediately with a reply. She glanced at the screen, lips curling into a faint smile. "She's at the flagship store tonight," she said. "She wants to meet us." Marcus raised a brow. "Tonight? She doesn't waste time." "Neither do I." Alicia slipped her phone back into her bag, straightened her jacket, and met Marcus's gaze. "Let's go." As their car pulled out of the parking lot, neither of them knew that Caroline was already deep in conversation with the store manager, and that Neil's actions were about to backfire in ways he never imagined. If you've ever been in a situation like this, tell us in the comments. What would you have done? The luxury boutique was still buzzing with quiet conversation and the soft rustling of designer fabrics, but behind closed doors, the storm had already begun. Inside the manager's office, Caroline Hastings sat with her arms crossed, her sharp gaze locked onto Robert Fenton, the store's general manager. She had always been the kind of woman who spoke with calculated precision, never raising her voice, never wasting a single word. And yet tonight, frustration simmered beneath her calm exterior. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said. Robert hesitated for a second too long. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I already know most of it, Robert. I just want to hear how you're going to fix it." Before he could answer, the door swung open. Neil Harris stepped inside. There was no arrogance in his stride, but no guilt either. His posture was stiff, his face unreadable, but the tension in his jaw, the slight flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, didn't go unnoticed by Caroline. Robert cleared his throat. "Neil, have a seat." Neil did as he was told, glancing between them. His fingers curled into a fist on his lap. "Is there a problem?" Caroline didn't react immediately. She tapped her fingers lightly against the desk, then reached for her tablet. With a flick of her wrist, the screen lit up. Surveillance footage paused at the exact moment Neil confronted Alicia and Marcus. His stomach tightened. "I assume you recognize yourself," Caroline said, her voice smooth but cold. Neil swallowed hard. "I was doing my job." Caroline arched a brow. "Your job?" Robert leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Neil, do you know who they are?" Neil frowned. "No idea. Just some people who didn't belong here?" Caroline interrupted, her words slicing through the room like glass. Silence. She pressed play. On screen, Alicia and Marcus browsed calmly, pointing at merchandise, speaking quietly. There was no suspicious behavior. No hesitation. The only disruption came when Neil approached them, his posture rigid, his tone sharp. Caroline let the footage speak for itself. Then she paused it again, leveling her gaze at Neil. "Do you want to try again?" Neil shifted in his seat. He could feel Robert watching him, waiting. "I was trying to protect the store," he said finally. Caroline's expression remained neutral, but her patience was wearing thin. "Protect it from what, exactly?" Neil opened his mouth, but no words came out. Caroline leaned forward, her voice dropping just slightly. "Because from where I'm sitting, the only thing they were guilty of was existing in a space you decided they didn't belong in." His face heated. He wanted to argue, wanted to push back, but the evidence was right there, staring him in the face. Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "Neil, this isn't just about tonight. There have been other complaints." Neil's head snapped up. "What?" Caroline slid her tablet across the table, allowing him to see the list of subtle but consistent reports from customers and staff alike. Moments he had barely registered, small comments, a suspicious glance. Little things that, stacked together, painted an undeniable picture. "This store has a reputation," Robert said quietly. "And right now, you've put it in serious jeopardy." Neil felt his chest tighten. You're dismissed," Caroline cut in, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. "Effective immediately." Neil went still. A beat of silence. Then, "You can't be serious." She met his gaze. "Clean out your locker. Security will escort you if necessary." He stared at her, disbelief mixing with something darker. His whole body tensed like he wanted to fight, but there was nothing left to fight for. Robert didn't say anything, because there was nothing left to say. Neil pushed back his chair, the legs scraping against the polished floor. Without another word, he turned and stormed out. Caroline didn't watch him go. Instead, she turned back to Robert. "We're not done here." Robert rubbed the back of his neck, already dreading what was coming next. Caroline folded her arms. One bad employee didn't create this problem, Robert. A system that allowed it to happen did. Outside the store, Marcus and Alicia were already seated in a private lounge inside the flagship location, waiting for Caroline. Alicia's posture was composed as always, but Marcus could see the tightness in her jaw, the way her fingers curled against the armrest. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus asked, watching her closely. Alicia turned her head, meeting his gaze. "We didn't start this, Marcus, but we're damn sure going to finish it." He exhaled, shaking his head with a small smile. "Remind me to never get on your bad side." She smirked, but before she could respond, the door opened. Caroline stepped inside, closing it behind her. "I appreciate you both meeting me on such short notice," she said, taking a seat across from them. Alicia studied her carefully. "I assume Neil's been dealt with." Caroline nodded. "He's gone." Marcus let out a slow breath. "Good." Caroline leaned forward, clasping her hands together. "But that's not enough." Alicia tilted her head slightly. "No, it's not." Caroline held her gaze. "I want to make sure this never happens again. And for that, I need your help." Alicia and Marcus exchanged a glance. "I want to fix the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place," Caroline continued. "Bias training, new policies, an anonymous reporting system. Real change, not just a PR move." Alicia tapped a single finger against the table, thoughtful. "And you expect us to just trust you?" Caroline didn't hesitate. "No, I expect you to hold me accountable." The room was silent for a moment. Then Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. "Well," he muttered, "she sure as hell knows how to make a pitch." Alicia studied Caroline for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right," she said. "Let's see if you're serious." Caroline extended her hand. Alicia took it. And just like that, the real work began. Have you ever witnessed discrimination like this? How would you have handled it? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more powerful stories like this, hit that subscribe button so you never miss one. The boutique had returned to its usual hum of quiet luxury. Shoppers browsed, employees smoothed down designer fabrics. A security guard, not Neil, stood near the entrance, his posture relaxed but attentive. But behind the elegant displays and marble countertops, change was already in motion. Inside a sleek conference room on the top floor, Caroline Hastings stood at the head of the table, her expression sharp, unwavering. Around her sat the store's department heads, HR representatives, and regional executives. A mix of emotions filled the space. Some wary, some defensive, some still unsure why they had been called here in the first place. Caroline let the silence stretch, let them feel the weight of it. Then she placed both hands on the table and spoke. "We have a problem. No sugarcoating, no corporate pleasantries." A few of the executives shifted in their seats. Robert Fenton, sitting to her left, cleared his throat. "Caroline, if this is about the Neil situation, it's not just about Neil," she interrupted, her voice even. "It's about everything that led to Neil." The room went still. She let out a slow breath, scanning their faces. "Tell me something. If Alicia and Marcus hadn't had a direct connection to me, if this hadn't blown up into a PR nightmare, would any of you have done something about it?" No one answered. Robert's jaw tightened. "You're saying this is systemic." "I'm saying it's been systemic." Another heavy silence. Then, one of the executives, Priya Patel from HR, leaned forward. "Caroline, I understand your frustration. But we've conducted diversity training before. We've never had an issue like this." "Not one we addressed," Caroline corrected. "But we've had complaints, haven't we?" She turned to Priya directly. Priya hesitated. Caroline folded her arms. "How many reports of racial bias or customer mistreatment have come through in the last year?" Priya's gaze dropped to the folder in front of her. She hesitated, flipping through a few pages before finally answering. 17. A murmur rippled through the room. Some looked surprised. Others suddenly found the table very interesting. Caroline's jaw clenched. 17, she repeated. "And how many of those were properly investigated?" Silence. Priya shifted uncomfortably. "We handled them internally." Caroline arched a brow. "Which is corporate speak for we did nothing." Robert sighed, rubbing his temples. "Caroline, what do you want us to do?" She straightened. "Change. Real change. Not optics. Not a press release. Not a box-ticking training session." She turned to the HR team. "We overhaul the training, No more 30-minute videos. We bring in experts, real specialists. We make it mandatory for every single employee from the floor staff to the executive level. Her gaze flicked to Robert. We also implement an anonymous reporting system, one that actually holds people accountable. Robert nodded slowly. And customer complaints? We start taking them seriously, Caroline exhaled. Because I will not be sitting in this room 6 months from now, having this same conversation. A murmur of agreement filled the room. Some still looked uncomfortable, but they knew she was right. Caroline took a breath, pressing forward. And one more thing. Alicia and Marcus Carter have agreed to advise us on these initiatives. That got their attention. Robert's brows lifted. They're willing to work with us? Caroline nodded. If they see genuine progress, and frankly, so am I. There was a final beat of silence before Robert sighed and leaned back. All right. Caroline glanced around the table. We start immediately. No more hesitation, no more excuses. This was happening. At that exact moment, Alicia and Marcus were sitting at their dining table, scrolling through news articles about the store. Marcus tapped the screen of his tablet. They issued a public statement. Alicia didn't look up. Let me guess, we deeply regret the incident and are taking steps to improve. Marcus smirked. Pretty much. He continued reading, then glanced at her. You think they mean it? Alicia set down her coffee, finally meeting his gaze. Caroline means it. Marcus considered that. And the rest of them? That's what we're going to find out. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her nails against the wooden surface. Marcus studied her for a moment before exhaling. You really think this is going to change anything? Alicia tilted her head. Did you think Neil was going to get fired? Marcus hesitated. Then, slowly, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Fair point. Her phone buzzed before she could respond. A text from Caroline. Can we meet tomorrow? I want to run something by you both. Alicia stared at the message, something flickering in her expression. She texted back. We'll be there. Back at the store, Neil stood in the employee locker room, shoving the last of his things into a duffel bag. His movements were stiff, jerky, his face burned with humiliation. Lisa, one of the store's senior employees, leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. I told you. Neil froze for half a second before scoffing. Told me what? Lisa tilted her head. That you didn't have to treat them like that. Neil slammed his locker shut. The metal rattled, the sound sharp in the quiet room. I was doing my job. Lisa didn't flinch. No, you were doing your version of your job. Neil shouldered his bag, his jaw tightening. Doesn't matter. They already made up their minds about me. Lisa exhaled. Maybe. Or maybe they just saw what was already there. Neil's grip on the strap of his bag tightened. Then he turned and walked out. Lisa watched him go, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. She wanted to believe that this moment would make him reflect, that he'd walk away and realize where he had gone wrong. But as she listened to the heavy stomp of his boots fading down the hall, she wasn't sure he was ready to face the truth. Caroline stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows in her office, staring out over the city's skyline. The battle wasn't over. She knew that. There were still employees who didn't get it, executives who thought this was just a temporary PR nightmare. But she also knew one thing for certain. This time, things were different. This time, people were paying attention, and she was going to make sure it stayed that way. Do you think Neil learned his lesson? Or do you think people like him ever truly change? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The boutique shimmered under soft lighting, as if nothing had changed. Customers browsed, the faint rustle of designer fabric filling the air, but beneath the surface, everything felt different. Employees moved through the store with a new kind of tension. Some whispered behind counters, throwing wary glances toward the security desk, where a different guard now stood in Neil Harris's place. Lisa adjusted a display of handbags near the front, but her mind was elsewhere. She could still hear Caroline Hastings' voice from the meeting earlier that morning, the way she had spoken with clear, unshakable authority. This isn't about punishing one employee and pretending the problem is solved, Caroline had said. This is about every single person in this company asking themselves how we got here in the first place. Lisa had stolen a glance at Derek, who sat stiffly in the meeting room, arms crossed. He had always backed Neil. had always laughed at his jokes, nodded along when he made comments Lisa had learned to ignore. But now, Derek looked uncomfortable. That alone told Lisa that things really were changing. She exhaled, smoothing down the display, when a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You think all this is going to fix anything?" She turned. Derek stood there, hands shoved into his pockets. His expression wasn't hostile, just uneasy. Lisa studied him for a moment before answering. "I don't know, but at least we're trying." Derek scoffed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Feels like corporate just trying to cover their ass." Lisa tilted her head. Or maybe they finally realized they've ignored this for too long. Derek didn't answer right away. And that, in itself, was new. For the first time since all of this started, he actually looked like he was thinking about it. Caroline Hastings sat in her office, flipping through pages of employee feedback from the first company-wide training session. Some responses were hopeful. Some were skeptical. Some were outright angry. Her eyes landed on one that simply read, "Why do we all have to suffer because one guy made a mistake?" Her jaw tightened. She knew that not everyone was going to get it. But that didn't mean she was going to stop. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A text from Alicia Carter. "Let's talk next steps. Tomorrow?" Caroline's lips curled into a faint smile. They weren't going to let her forget this promise. "Good," she texted back. "Tomorrow." Neil Harris sat in his darkened apartment, a beer bottle sweating in his grip. The television flickered in the background, muted news coverage of his own downfall playing out in real time. He had turned off his phone hours ago. The messages, the calls, he couldn't stand to read them anymore. They had painted him as the villain. Maybe he was. He rubbed a hand over his face, staring at the screen as news anchors discussed his actions like he was some kind of cautionary tale. Luxury boutique fires security guard after racial profiling incident. Calls for industry-wide reform gain traction. His stomach twisted as they showed the surveillance footage. Him standing over Alicia and Marcus. Him pushing them out. Him wearing that smug expression he hadn't even realized was on his face at the time. He had thought he was doing his job. Thought he was being proactive. Now, all he could think about was how wrong he had looked in that moment. His eyes flicked to the comments running beneath the news segment. "People like him are why these things keep happening. Hope he never works again." He scowled, shutting off the TV. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to blame someone else. But the problem was, he had done this to himself. And now, for the first time, he wasn't sure what came next. Back at the store, employees gathered in the break room for a scheduled follow-up discussion about the new policies being implemented. The air was thick with mixed emotions. Some were curious, some still didn't care. Others, like Lisa, were watching closely, waiting to see who would actually step up. Caroline stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding but calm. "I know there are a lot of feelings about what's been happening," she said, voice even, "so let's talk about it." Silence. Then, finally, a voice from the back. "This just feels like we're being forced to apologize for something we didn't even do." Lisa turned, recognizing David, one of the senior employees. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, clearly unimpressed. Caroline met his gaze without hesitation. "No one is asking you to apologize," she said, "but we are asking you to look at the reality of how we've operated and how we can do better." David scoffed. "I treat everyone the same. I don't see color." A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Caroline tilted her head. "And that's the problem, David," he frowned. "What?" "When you say you don't see color," she continued, "you're ignoring the reality that not everyone gets treated the same in spaces like this." David shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just saying, not all of us are like Neil." Caroline's gaze sharpened. "But some of us let people like Neil go unchecked." Silence. Lisa felt something shift in the room. Caroline exhaled, her tone softening just slightly. "This isn't about blaming anyone. It's about recognizing what we've ignored for too long." Lisa glanced around, watching people's reactions. Some were still skeptical, but some actually looked like they were thinking. And that was something. That night, Alicia Carter sat at her kitchen counter, scrolling through messages on her phone. Marcus walked in, dropping his keys onto the table. "Caroline, get back to you?" Alicia nodded. "We're meeting tomorrow." Marcus poured himself a glass of water. Think she's actually serious about all this? Alicia tapped her nails against the counter. I think she knows we're watching. Marcus smirked. Then let's make sure she doesn't forget. She returned the smirk, locking her phone. Oh, she won't. Do you think real change is possible, or do companies just try to protect their image? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The boutique looked the same as it always had. Pristine, elegant, untouched by the chaos that had unfolded within its walls. But the people inside knew better. The weight of recent events lingered like a ghost, following employees as they moved through the store. There were whispers, side glances, conversations that stopped the second certain people walked into the room. Not everyone was happy about the changes. And that was exactly why Caroline Hastings wasn't slowing down. She stood in a conference room, arms crossed, watching as Alicia and Marcus Carter flipped through a revised version of the store's new employee training manual. This isn't bad, Alicia murmured, scanning the pages. Marcus let out a low hum. It's a start. Caroline studied them. That's why I asked you here. I don't want to do the bare minimum. I want to do it right. Alicia met her gaze, searching for any sign of hesitation, any hint that this was just another corporate damage control stunt. She found none. Marcus closed the manual, sitting back in his chair. All right, let's talk about what's missing. Caroline exhaled, relieved. They weren't here to praise her. They were here to push her. And that was exactly what she needed. Neil Harris hadn't slept. The morning sun crept through the blinds of his small apartment, but he hadn't bothered to close them. He sat on his couch, scrolling through news articles, social media posts, comments, all of them about him. Some people had already moved on, but the ones who hadn't, they were tearing him apart. He ran a hand over his face, his jaw tightening. He had always thought of himself as one of the good guys, someone who followed the rules, who kept order. So why did everything feel like it was crumbling beneath him? His eyes landed on a post from the boutique's official account, a statement from Caroline Hastings. We're not just making changes, we're making a commitment. His stomach twisted. He knew what that meant. There was no coming back from this. He shut his laptop. He needed to get out of here. Inside the store, employees gathered for another meeting, the tension thick enough to choke on. Caroline stood at the front, her presence commanding but calm. I know some of you are tired of talking about this, she said, but that's exactly why we have to keep talking about it. Derek sat near the back, arms crossed. I just don't get why we're the ones being punished. We didn't do anything. Caroline's expression didn't waver. No one is being punished. We're being asked to do better. Lisa glanced around, noting the mixed reactions. Some people nodded. Some still resisted. But the conversations were happening. And that was something. Alicia and Marcus walked through the store later that evening, their presence drawing quiet attention. Employees stole glances, whispering behind shelves. They weren't just customers anymore. They were the reason everything was changing. Lisa hesitated before stepping forward. It's good to see you both again. Alicia studied her. Is it? Lisa swallowed. Yeah, I think it is. Alicia held her gaze a moment longer before nodding. Maybe, just maybe, this place could be different. Neil stood across the street, hands stuffed in his pockets, watching through the glass windows as Alicia and Marcus spoke with employees. He should have left, should have walked away, but he couldn't, because standing there watching them, it hit him all at once. They weren't the problem. He was. For the first time, Neil wasn't angry, he was just lost. And for the first time, he didn't know what to do next. Do you think people like Neil can change? Or do they just regret getting caught? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The store had settled back into its usual rhythm, but everyone knew it wasn't the same. Employees moved with a new awareness, some careful, some resistant, all of them watching, waiting to see if the changes would stick. Caroline Hastings sat in her office, reviewing yet another round of feedback. Some employees were embracing the training, engaging in discussions. Others, not so much. She set her pen down, exhaling. Real change wasn't about making one big move. It was about showing up every single day. And right now? She needed to make sure this wasn't just a moment. Her phone buzzed. Alicia Carter. She answered immediately. Tell me you've got good news. Alicia's voice was even. That depends. Did your managers actually listen? Caroline smirked. Why don't you come find out for yourself? Neil Harris hadn't been back to the store since the day he'd been fired. He told himself he didn't care, that it didn't matter, but he still found himself walking past it, his stomach twisting every time he caught a glimpse of his old workplace through the glass windows. It was like the world had moved on without him. Because it had. He knew it was only a matter of time before he had to figure out what came next. But for the first time in his life, he had no idea what that was. Inside the store, employees gathered for another session. The room felt different this time. Not as tense, not as guarded. Caroline stood at the front, scanning the faces in front of her. "We're not here to check a box," she said. "We're here to make sure this place becomes somewhere people feel safe." Lisa sat toward the front, watching closely. Derek sat near the back, arms still crossed, but this time, he was actually listening. That was progress. Alicia and Marcus walked through the store later that evening, noting the subtle changes. More employees greeting customers, more awareness in their movements. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Lisa approached them, hesitating. "I just wanted to say, I've been thinking a lot about everything." Alicia raised a brow. "And?" Lisa exhaled. "And I'm trying." For the first time, Alicia smiled. "That's all we ask." Neil sat alone in a coffee shop, staring at his phone. He had spent his whole life believing he was one of the good ones. Now, he wasn't sure what that meant anymore. Maybe it was time to start figuring it out. Do you think real change is happening? Or is it just temporary? Share your thoughts in the comments. The boutique glowed under warm lighting, its sleek displays and pristine counters untouched by the storm that had shaken its foundation. From the outside it looked the same, but inside, everything had changed. Caroline Hastings walked the store floor, her sharp eyes scanning the space, not for aesthetics but for people. How they moved, how they spoke to customers, how they interacted with each other. Change wasn't about policies written in a handbook. It was about what happened when no one was watching. Lisa stood by the jewelry counter, adjusting a display. She glanced up, spotting Caroline, and for the first time, there was no tension. "Things feel different," Lisa said almost to herself. Caroline stopped beside her. "Do they?" Lisa nodded slowly. "Yeah, not perfect, but better." Caroline let out a quiet breath. "Then we're on the right track." Neil Harris hadn't stepped inside the store since the day he'd been fired. But that didn't mean he wasn't thinking about it. He sat in his car across the street, fingers gripping the steering wheel, watching people walk in and out. He had spent weeks trying to tell himself that what happened wasn't fair, that he had just been doing his job. But deep down, he knew the truth. It hadn't been about policy. It had been about assumption. And for the first time in his life, he was questioning what that said about him. He wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. But the fact that he was even asking the question, that was something. Alicia and Marcus Carter stepped into the store, their presence drawing quiet glances. Employees noticed them now, not out of suspicion, but out of recognition. Marcus leaned toward Alicia. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Alicia nodded. "Let's see if it stays that way." Lisa hesitated before approaching them. "I wanted to say something," she said carefully. "About everything." Alicia waited. Lisa exhaled. "I can't change the past, but I can do better now." Alicia studied her, then gave a small nod. "Then do it. No praise, no long speech. Because real change wasn't about words, it was about action." Caroline sat in her office late that night, flipping through the latest reports. Customer satisfaction had risen, employee complaints had dropped. But more than that, there was a shift happening. She leaned back in her chair, knowing there was still a long road ahead. But for the first time, she wasn't carrying the weight of it alone. And that was how she knew this wasn't just a temporary fix. This was the beginning of something real. Do you think true change is possible? Or do people just learn to act differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments. The boutique looked untouched by change. Polished floors gleaming, soft instrumental music playing through hidden speakers, the scent of fresh leather and delicate perfumes lingering in the air. But for those who worked here, who had been through everything, there was no denying it. Nothing was the same. Lisa stood behind the jewelry counter, watching a customer inspect a sapphire bracelet. A month ago, she wouldn't have thought twice about who walked through the doors. She wouldn't have questioned what she didn't see. Now, she noticed everything, The way some customers were treated differently, the way some employees still hesitated, the way old habits didn't disappear overnight. Change wasn't about one meeting, one training session, one firing. It was about the truth that stays. She glanced up as Caroline Hastings walked through the store, her presence commanding but natural. Caroline had been relentless. Some employees had pushed back. Some had left altogether. And yet she was still here. Because real change? It didn't happen by waiting for people to get comfortable. Neil Harris had spent the last few weeks trying to convince himself that he didn't care, that losing his job, his reputation, his sense of control, none of it mattered. But that was a lie. He sat alone at a coffee shop, staring at a news article about the store's ongoing changes. His name wasn't mentioned anymore. The story had moved on. He wished he could say the same. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what came next, and that scared him more than anything. Alicia and Marcus Carter walked through the boutique, their presence no longer a test, but a reminder. The last time they were here, they had been pushed out. Now, employees greeted them, not out of obligation, but because they finally understood what had been wrong all along. Marcus glanced at Alicia. "So, what do you think?" She scanned the room. The quiet shifts in behavior, the way people paid attention now. "It's better," she admitted, "but better isn't enough." Marcus smirked. "That's why they're lucky you're not letting this go." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes, because she knew the hardest part of change wasn't starting, it was making sure it never stopped. Caroline sat at her desk late into the night, reviewing the store's latest employee reports. There were still issues, still people resisting. But there were also people like Lisa, like Derek, who had once been bystanders and were now speaking up. She closed the file, leaning back in her chair. This wasn't over. And that was exactly why she was still here. Because this time, they weren't just moving past it. They were building something better. Do you think real change is lasting, or do people always go back to old habits? Drop your thoughts in the comments.